So how brittle is that going to turn out to be? I think the core vulnerability for the future, David, is not necessarily the effectiveness of the Chinese surveillance state, because it's phenomenally effective, not just Xinjiang, but for Han Chinese, social credit scores, surveillance systems, reporting systems, etc. The contraction of private space within the Chinese, as it were, way of life, compared with just 5 or 10 years ago. I think the ability for an authoritarian state to deploy the new technologies of surveillance, as you know from your own studies and observations, is formidable. And if you look at previous generations of authoritarians, or either the right or the left, most of them would have given their hind teeth for anything approximating what you can now achieve through facial recognition cubed, But I think the vulnerability is this: it's the economy. The brittleness lies in, if you've got a reassertion and a resurgence of politics and ideology, what I'd paraphrased before as a movement to the left on pure politics and the political economy. Ultimately, the private sector in China is not much different from the private sector anywhere else. They want to earn a quid, a dollar, or a renminbi. They want to maximize profits. They want to minimize regulations if they can. They don't want politics in their hair, and they want to have enough confidence to continue to invest. Whereas if you look at Alibaba and Didi and the recent phenomena that we see, the real brittleness potentially lies in the compromise to a 35-year-long success story in Deng Xiaoping's market-based economic reforms and the liberation of the private sector. And that spills through to prosperity.
I want to relate that to something that you've been writing about. You recently sent round a speech that you made at Tsinghua University, making a renewed case for what you call managed strategic competition, quote unquote, between the US and China. And you argue for managed strategic competition because you fear, or you believe, that the risk of war is serious enough to be taken as a sufficient danger that an alternative concept needs to be inserted that allows room for competition alongside room for cooperation. And I think it'd be very beneficial, albeit sobering, for this audience to hear why you consider the risk of war to be sufficiently grave or grave, and how managed strategic competition as a concept is important in ensuring that that doesn't happen.
Well, on the question, for example, of nationalism in China, the truth is nationalism has changed and is changing the nature of the body politic in the country. If it becomes increasingly an essential pillar of domestic political legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party, then it makes China increasingly, as it were, robust in the way in which it's likely to respond to what it perceives to be external provocation. And that is a trend line going like that. So that's factor number one. And when I say that Xi Jinping is moving Chinese nationalism to the right, just as the center of gravity for Chinese politics, and as I've written elsewhere, and for the political economy is moving somewhat to the left, then there are things that arise from that, which, as I said, make the normal conduct of international relations more difficult than they were before. Secondly, there's the nature of military weaponry. You know as well as I do, through robotic warfare and the application of algorithmic approaches to the deployment of weapon systems and communications time, that the human, as it were, intervention factor becomes less and less. So therefore, we've got incidents at sea and incidents in the air. Then the ability for something to trigger and give us a 21st century Sarajevo event, which then ricochets literally and escalates and then turbocharged by domestic nationalisms, then you've got a real problem. So I think it's these two sets of factors, plus thirdly, a much more assertive Chinese body politic through Xi Jinping anyway, and America in the last year or two having embarked upon a defined course in reverse gear, whereby the Americans have concluded that unless they confront this challenge, that it is the end of America as a global power. Put those three factors together, that's enough to cause some of us to lose sleep at night. Therefore, you can either have unmanaged strategic competition a la Trump, which is get on the roller coaster ride at Coney Island and just see what happens. And you might stay on the tracks and you'll have some hairpin turns, or you might come screaming off altogether. Or you have managed strategic competition with guardrails constructed around it. And without spending too much time on that here, guardrails around the strategic red lines of each side so that there is a reasonable and effective level of transparency between Washington and Beijing on the 4 or 5 things that really matter, from Taiwan through to cyber attacks. Secondly, full-blown competition in every other dimension of the relationship: non-lethal security policy, foreign policy, full breadth, trade, investment, technology, human rights, ideology, and the rest, while still also carving out space for a collaborative relationship where global public goods are still sufficiently important to both Washington, Beijing, and the rest of us, like on climate change, to warrant a collaborative arrangement. So that's the basis of my argument, which I put both the Chinese and the American side. Whether it obtains any traction or not remains to be seen,